The following isn't spoiler-free, but is less of an analysis or frame-by-frame review of the premiere and more of my personal thoughts and feelings regarding Star Trek Discovery thus far. I find myself unable and somewhat unwilling to take my emotions and personal history with Star Trek out of the discussion, and won't be approaching this from an objective perspective at all. Last night, at the time of filming this, Amanda and I went over to her parents' place and watched the premiere of Star Trek Discovery with her parents on her dad's projector down in his den of Star Trek fandom. Decades of memorabilia on every wall and on every shelf, the severed head of a Ferengi, a darn cool lunchbox, staring at me from the corner of the room. Watching the premiere of a new Star Trek series has always been a major event for both of our families. Star Trek in general had a substantial effect on both my wife and I growing up. It feels like a part of our family, part of our lens through which we view the world. It is a shared cultural lexicon within both of our families that is a significant part of how my wife and I bonded in the first place. Its history, messages, and terminology are part of our daily lives. Every premiere of a new chapter in the Star Trek saga is burned in my mind, both as a child and as an adult. A memory of excitement, the suspense of wondering what's to come, and the familiar comfort of a sense of hope and human potential entangled with stories that explore the endless cosmos and face the dangers of the unknown, with every facet of existence explored, politics, war, religion. I could go on and on about Star Trek as a whole and its influence on my life, but we need to move on to Discovery itself. Going into this premiere, something felt different. Perhaps it is the fault of the constant stream of social media in this day, the wrathful condemnation of things that haven't even premiered yet, or the blind defense of the same thing based solely on some sense of brand loyalty. Much of what I saw and read during the year up to its release had dwindled that familiar excitement and curiosity. I sat down expecting a soulless, flashy, modern CGI shell of what once was, but hoping that I would be wrong and my expectations would be shattered and a new era of compelling Star Trek TV was upon us. I went to bed a few hours later with conflicting emotions. In some ways, I got exactly what I had expected, but I didn't feel as negative towards what I had seen as I had predicted. I thought the credits would roll and I'd say, "Frell that Dren," and leave Discovery to those who found something positive in it I hadn't. But instead, I had a revelation that resolved my conflicting opinions. It's not my Star Trek, but I can't say it was terrible sci-fi. And I do hope you take the time to listen to this entire video to really understand what I mean by that. At the heart of Star Trek is a humanistic exploration of mankind's potential, with many utilitarian aspects, a permeating sense of hope, even in the darkest of storylines, a collection of morality tales and examinations of relevant social issues and greater concepts of existence, against the backdrop of alien cultures all packed into a continuing story of exploration and the constant push into the unknown. It's not afraid to slow down for anthropological study, examinations of personal relationships, something that some people might see as boring, but I think is very compelling and necessary for the crafting of an ever-growing intricate web of races and cultures. But it can still explode on screen with some of the most dynamic action and fascinating stories of massive interstellar war, or sometimes harrowing and sorrowful, dramatic moments. When taken as a whole, I think Star Trek is in many ways unparalleled in its world building and its expansive universe. And when Star Trek is at its very best, it can do all of this without losing sight of the day-in-the-life elements that make its many worlds feel real, its characters feel relatable, and without losing sight of its core philosophy even in the darkest moments. It's this collective spirit of Star Trek that is thus far missing from Discovery. It's bad Trek, barely Trek, but it isn't bad sci-fi when viewed as its own thing. In fact, I think, well, actually I'm certain, I would feel more positively about Discovery if it wasn't Star Trek. Visually, I detest the majority of its artistic direction within the context of what the show is, but not in the general sense. I actually like a lot of it. No matter how I feel about the artistic direction, the visual quality is astounding. While the directing itself felt a little too far separated from familiar Trek territory and had far more in common with the newer Kelvin Universe films, it did suit the more cinematic style it was reaching for. It accomplished its goal, even if it wasn't what I really wanted. It had a fantastic feature film feel with some beautiful space scenes, excellent aliens, interesting architecture, and thrilling shots. The dark, metallic look fits the mood of the serialized story it is setting up. Visually, everything was great, and yet, on some level, I kind of hated it. I hated it not for what it was visually, but for what it wasn't. Canon and continuity are brought up a lot with things like Discovery, and were a hot topic and still are back when Enterprise first ran, and for good reason. Going back to tell a story is difficult in most cases, but in the case of Star Trek, where you have decades upon decades of stories, hundreds upon hundreds of episodes, multiple movies, it's nearly impossible to get right. But in the case of Discovery, it feels like they didn't even try. If you want to make something with a fresh new look, don't make your setting the past. You don't make a film set in the 1920s look like it's the 1980s, just as you don't make Discovery look as it does. And if you don't think that, I guess you could call it retro look, even though you can make a little bit of a modern twist on it, if you don't think that would appeal to modern audiences and wouldn't make money, then that's not the story you tell. This takes place a near decade before the original series, and at a time when the original Enterprise would already be in service under Captain Pike, so there's no way it would look so unbelievably far removed from something like this, a more recent look at the original style of the Star Trek bridge from an episode of Enterprise. A slightly more metallic and slightly toned down color-wise version of this type of bridge would have fit this setting perfectly without losing its modern edge. They went way too far in one direction visually, and the same idea goes for nearly everything in Discovery. I don't dislike that look on its own merit, but I can't remove it from its context. Don't even get me started on the Klingons and why the change from their look in the original series to the Next Generation era is not a justification for this change. The video will be long enough and that topic has been beaten to death already. Suffice it to say, I kept hoping there'd be some sort of explanation within the episode as far as, the ship itself was thousands of years old and maybe they were awakened at this time of prophecy and were actually thousands of year old Klingons and some reason, but no, that's not the case. So far, I don't hate their look, but I hate them as far as being Klingons within this time frame and context. Oh, and using those holographic messaging systems that didn't exist until Deep Space Nine over 100 years later, what the hell was that? You do not slap a new chapter in a book that has already been written and printed, and not make it match. If Discovery wants to be its own thing visually, then it should have been its own thing. Visually, it looks great, but not for what it is, and I'd have to make that distinction there. I have the exact same feelings about the intro. I love the theme song. My wife disliked it for being too close to the theme of the original series, but I liked it as a bit of an homage to the era in which it takes place, being so close to that series with a mix of something original, and I think the sound itself was the blend that it did not accomplish visually. And I did really like the visuals of the intro sequence if viewed in a void, but this is a show called Discovery with no sense of discovery in the introduction, and it is a serialized dramatic series largely about a military conflict, which is also not represented in the intro. It looks cool, it sounds fantastic, but it doesn't fit the context of the show. Moving on from the visuals, all I have to say about the audio, the score, and the sound effects, in all, I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it fit the tone of the action on screen. I also loved that the Klingons were speaking Klingon with subtitles throughout every scene on their ship. I really, really liked that. The story itself is one I want to see told, and doing it as a more serialized drama akin to something like Game of Thrones is exactly the way it should be told, but don't forget the spirit and feeling of Star Trek in the process. I love sci-fi telling this sort of story. I enjoyed Babylon 5 enough to go back and start collecting the series on Laserdisc. Deep Space Nine is my favorite Star Trek iteration by far, and I consider the last 5 seasons of that show to be some of the greatest science fiction television ever produced. But even in the midst of the Dominion War, Deep Space Nine still felt like Star Trek at its core. The message was still one of hope, even when everything seemed about to be lost forever. While Discovery felt inundated with a sense of hopeless defeatism and negativity, and it failed to give me much of anything to like or feel a sense of kinship with the characters to make me feel their peril and form an emotional bond with them in their struggle. This, I felt, was in no way the fault of the actors as a whole. And if there is one slight exception, both my wife and I genuinely liked and want to see more of Doug Jones as Lieutenant Saru. He has the making of a fantastic character. Chris Obey presented a phenomenal delivery of T'Kuvma as well. Michelle Yeoh did an admirable job, as she always does, but her relationship to the members of the crew didn't quite feel genuine, and much of the dialogue, especially in the opening desert scene, felt forced and largely expositional. The character of Michael Burnham frustrated me. I saw little wrong with the performance itself, but the character, whose forced backstory is awful, came across as blatantly disrespectful, arrogant, spiteful, and in no way like someone who is nearly ready for her own command. Even before the true turmoil began, she seemed to genuinely dislike and distrust her own crew, and did so far too openly for someone of her rank and position. Even when a fellow officer felt they were vehemently in the right in past Star Treks, when he or she thought themselves intellectually superior and that their superior officer was fully in the wrong, there was a sense of respect for the position, if not the opinion. Her dialogue beats the early episodes of 7 of 9 for smug subordination. Michelle Yeoh came across as a much more respectable, strong female character, but given that the acting performance itself was good, I haven't written off the character of Michael yet. I definitely see potential in that character, even with the rough beginning and the backstory that I detest. Overall, I'm stating here that I refuse to join either party of warring zealots. I won't defend Discovery until my last breath simply because it has the name Star Trek slapped on it like some unquestioning religious fervor, nor will I endlessly bash it and call anyone who likes it stupid, because at this point it is in no way a bad sci-fi show. Most of it's actually pretty good. But it is bad Star Trek. It may have the Star Trek name, but it is not the Star Trek I know and love, and I'm perfectly okay with that. There's more Star Trek material out there that I can shake a battle at that, and for me to love over the years to come, and re-enjoy. And I will try to enjoy Discovery for what it is, and for what good there is in it, even if it's not the show I wanted, nor the show the franchise deserves. In the end, I'm also left with the question of, was this the right story to bring to the table at this time? As I said, I think it has the building blocks of a great story, and I will always welcome an exploration of any aspect of Klingon history or culture. But in the spirit of the franchise, shouldn't the first Star Trek series in over a decade be primarily about, I don't know, exploration and discovery?